All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Shindi and Avram Kelman, in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Alana Falik in memory of their parents, Jerome and Bernice Kelman, and Alexander and Frederica David, Zichronim Livracha. To thank Barak, Maya, Sandy Hoffman, Dora Limas, and Avi Malamed for dedicating the shurim this month in memory of Ruvain ben Emmanuel, Zichronim Livracha. To thank Ayala and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating the shurim this month in the Schus Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha. Daf Yomi shir for dedicating the shir this month in the Schus Refuah Shalema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Jeff's mother, Eleanor Cohn, Elka Bas Binyamin Tzvi, Zichronim Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Louis Goldberg, thanking Hashem for the engagement of his grandson, Eli Bogart, to Rivi Galaskov, daughter of Steve Galaskov, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. To thank Joseph and Ellen Miller, Iris and Ed Miller and family, Leslie and Adam Rosen and family, Lezech, dedicating the Shurim this week, Lezech Nishmas, Richard Berman, beloved brother, uncle, Mirza Hashem, the Neshama Shtav and Aliyah, and the family Ein Nechama. With that, let us begin. So we have a great daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Ayin Dalid 74, and we are picking up Mirza Hashem on the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis. We are going to pick up today Mirza Hashem. Let's actually pick up Esvei 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom. Last word on the line. Hopefully you did your homework a little bit. So the Gemara says as follows. So remember again, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. Actually, the truth is where we left off in the sugya. So again, it's 2, 4, 6 lines up from the bottom. Last word on the line, Esvei. So if you remember again, we had a statement of Rabbah. So let's take one more step back. All of this is rooted in the machlokes Rav and Shmuel that we had at the beginning of yesterday's daf. That machlokes was about the following scenario. A man makes a t'nai on his kiddushin. Let me say it differently. Reuven is mekadesh Rachel. At the time of the kiddushin, he makes a t'nai. Whatever the t'nai was, the t'nai that we were going with was, he makes a t'nai, Hare'at nekudesh asli, you are betrothed to me, amenas she'ein alayich nedarim, that you have no nedarim upon you. He does not reiterate that t'nai at the time of Nisuin. So Machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, what do? Is that, and now we'll say, of course, fast forward, they get married, they do Nisuin, and what do we discover? She has Nedarim. So the shaila now is, what's the status of the marriage? So remember again, Rav said that she requires a get. Now, saying that she requires a get effectively means that what? That halacha l'maisa, the marriage is valid. The marriage is valid, and therefore, in order to dissolve it, you need a get. Rav's logic was, Ein Adam Oseb Bi'ilaso Bi'ilas Znus. Shmuel, on the other hand, held that halacha she doesn't need a get. Why doesn't she need a get? Because Shmuel held that once he made the t'nai at the time of Kiddushin, the t'nai does not have to be reiterated in order for it to stick. Once you make it at the beginning, right, the assumption is that ultimately it remains with every stage of marriage. And therefore, it turns out that she does have Nedarim. Because she does have Nedarim, therefore, halacha l'maisa, the marriage is void. Comes along Rabbah, and this is on Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, and we did this, this was towards the end of yesterday's shir. Comes along Rabbah, and Rabbah says, by the way, the Machlokes Rav and Shmuel is only what Rabbah called Isha Achos. Now, for example, we'll say, what does that mean? I'm sorry, Machlokes is only about Isha Achos. Let me say it differently. The machlokes ultimately again is, So let me rephrase it in the positive. That according to Rabbah, Taos Isha Achas Gredasa Divrei Hakol Einot Tzricha Hemenu Get. So Rabbah said the machlokes in Rav and Shmuel is only in the case of, remember again, we had this yesterday, Taos Isha Achas Ke'ein Shtei Nashim. But in a case of Taos Isha Achas Gredasa, everyone agrees she does not require a get. Or to say it simply, what Rabbah holds is that in Rabbah's understanding of the machlokes, both Rav and Shmuel will agree that in a case where Reuven made a t'nai at the time of Kiddushin and did not reiterate the t'nai at the time of Nisuin, everyone agrees that ultimately what? The t'nai holds. That's what Rabbah comes along. So Rabbah wanted to reframe the machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, and in a case Rabbah say where t'nai was made at the beginning of Kiddushin, or at Kiddushin and was not reiterated at Nisuin, everyone agrees that the T'nai is in effect, and therefore non-compliance with the T'nai ultimately voids the marriage. Okay, that's what we're up to. So the Gemara says, Eisvei. So I'll say the Gemara is going to ask a series of questions on Rabbah. So Eisvei, the Gemara raised the kasha, Modim Chachamim Rabbi Eliezer, Biktano, Shesiavia, Beniskar Shavi Yisom Chayevav. So we'll say a very interesting case. So the Gemara raised the kasha. The Chum agree with Rabbi Eliezer in the following situation. Biktano Shesiavia. So remember again, you have a Kitano whose father married her off. What's the status if the father marries off a Kitano? Kiddushin da Araisa. So what happens? Viniskarsha. They will say Viniskarsha. How does she get divorced? How does such a girl get divorced? Her father is makabel the get on her behalf. So okay, so father married off daughter. We'll call her Rachel. Rachel is a Kitana. He marries off Rachel to Ruvain. Then Ruvain divorces Rachel. How does Ruvain divorce Rachel? He gives Rachel's father a get on her behalf. Fine. Now both say, what's her status now? V'hiyisom b'chayi ha'av. Now, we'll say she is called an orphan with a living parent. Why is she called an orphan with a living parent? Because although her father is alive, her father no longer has the right to go ahead and what? Marry her off again. Now, what happens? Vechzira. So, we'll see now, interestingly enough, what happened over here? So, ultimately, again, Rashi says, Vechzira, 3 lines up from the bottom. Vechzira, first I'll take the previous Rashi. V'yisom b'chaya, 4 lines up in Rashi. Af b'chaya bia hi kiyisom, lefi shiyatza merushusom minisuin harishonim, v'shuv ein lo schus ba l'kabel kiddusha. So, we'll say, this is a concept we've seen many times before. We saw it a bunch of times in Yevamis, that essentially, once a father marries off his daughter, and she enters into Nisuin, even as a Kitana, he loses rights in her. To the point that even if she is divorced as a Kitana, he no longer regains his rights. That is called a Yisoma Bechaye Avia, an orphan with a living parent. So now what happens? Vechzira, now look at Rashi once more, Vechzira, Bekatnusa, Umais Kitana Neklum. So we'll say now what happens? What happens? She goes ahead and she gets remarried as a Kitana. She gets married as a Kitana. So watch this. Vechzira. So I'll say, so now I play this out. Okay, just to follow the progression. Father marries his minor daughter Rachel off to Ruvain. Good. Kiddushin da'araisa. Beautiful. What happens? Ruvain divorces Rachel. Not so beautiful. She's still a Kitana. Right? Her father receives the get on her behalf. Once the father receives the get, that's the last right, so to speak, the father has in his daughter. So now she's a Yisoma b'chaya biha. Rachel gets married again. Herself. What's the status of that marriage when she gets married again herself? Right? Pretty much nothing. Right? Nothing. Maisa kitana eina klum. It's not even like a case of where her mother or her brother marries her off. At least there is kiddushay dirabanan. Nothing. What happens? She marries, okay, we'll say Shimon. What happens? Now Shimon dies without children. Shecholet says, v'lo misyav emes. Ultimately, again, she does chalitza. And she does not do Yibum. She does not do Yibum. So Shabbos says, I'm sorry, she remarries Ruvain, excuse me, I'm sorry. The case is where she remarries the man who she divorced. So now what happens? She remarries Ruvain, right? And now Ruvain dies without children. What's the halacha in this case? Shecholet says, v'lo misyav emes. Ultimately, again, she has to do chalitza. She cannot do Yibum. Why? This is very interesting. Because Rabbi say her gerushin, her divorce, is a biblical divorce. But her remarriage is not a complete remarriage. So Rabbi say, when is this true? Because Rabbi say, remember again, think about this. Her remarriage to Ruvain at most is what? At most is Drabanan. So when is this true? So it's interesting. So you have a biblical divorce, and at most a rabbinic marriage. So the Gemara says, now look at Rashi for just a moment. Shegerusha gerushin gemurim v'ne'esra alav iser kares machmas gerushas ochiv shatora amra ervas achicha ve'in chazaras gemura lachsra lios isha b'mogomes. So let's listen to this. So once Ruvain divorces Rachel, so ultimately again Rachel becomes asura to Ruvain's brother, right? To Ruvain's brother. Now, granted, they get remarried. That's very nice. But Lamaisa, again, a Kiddushin Derabanan doesn't have the ability to set aside an Isser Da'araisa. So Medram, when is this so? Shegirsha, Kishikitano, Vechzir Kishikitano. That's only if what? Ruvain divorced her when she was a Kitana, and then what? Remarried her when she was a Kitana. Because now Rabbi say what? I have a Gerushin Da'araisa, which generates an Isser Da'araisa of Ruvain's brother, towards Ruvain's brother, and only a marriage to Rabbanon. Aval girsha kishi kitana v'echzir kishi gidola. But if Reuven divorced Rachel when she was a kitana and remarried her when she's a gidola, in that case, I will say, then what? Then what? The marriage is a daraisa marriage. O shechzira kishi kitana v'gadla etzlo. Or he remarried Rachel when she was a kitana, but she became a gidola while married to him, and what I will say, and right, the God la'etzlo, umes, and then he died, ochol letzes, omes yavemes. In that case, then she could do chalitza or yibum. Why, Rabbi say? What's the difference? Because in those cases, now she has a biblical marriage as well. Now the Gemara says as follows: Mishur Rabbi Eliezer Omru, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, they said, top of Ayin Dalid, choletzes velo misyavemes. Rabbi say, Rabbi Eliezer says, even in this case, even in the case either where he remarried her when she was a gedola, or he married her as a ketana, but she became a gedola while married to him, Rabbi Eliezer still says she has to do chalitza and she can't do yibum. She can't do yibum. To which the Gemara says, but 1 second. V'ha-ha-ha. Then Rabbi say, in this case, let's analyze it for just a moment. Let's take a look at this. So we'll say now we have effectively two cases. Case number one, Reuven was married to Rachel as a ketana, right? Rachel's father married Rachel off to Reuven as a ketana. Now what happened? So watch this. Now what happened? Case number one is now Reuven divorced Rachel. Okay, so we'll say, so now what happens? Reuven remarries Rachel. So case number one, where Reuven remarried Rachel, Reuven then died while Rachel was still a ketana. In that case, everyone agrees that what? No, only chalitza, no yibum, right? Makes sense, because I have an isser da'oraisa about Rachel with her brother-in-law, and only kiddushin d'Rabbanan. Case number two is same first part. Reuven remarries Rachel, but in this case either she becomes a gedola. Well, let me start with the other case. Case number two is he remarries her when she's a gedola. If he remarries her when she's a gedola, then what? Then what? Biblical marriage. So biblical marriage, yibum or chalitza, no problem. Or second case, or 2a we'll call it, is where he remarried her while she was a ketana, and what? She became a gedola over the course of the marriage, and then he dies. And there the Gemara says also, she could do chalitza or yibum. The Gemara says, that's interesting. V'ha-ha-ha. Rabbi say, in that case, where Reuven remarries Rachel as a ketana, and then she becomes a gedola, isn't that a case, dikitos isha achas dami upligi? Rabbi say, isn't that a case? Look at Rashi, v'ha-ha-ha, gabi echzira kishi ketana v'gadol etzlo, where he remarries Rachel as a ketana, and then ultimately she becomes a gedola, ditos isha achasi, tos kidushe ketana. Then Rabbi say, here's what's interesting about that case. That's a case where he marries her as a ketana, and now she goes in and she becomes a gedola. Then Rabbi say, that's an interesting case. Why? Because the first bia that he's having with his remarried wife is as what? As a ketana. Then Rabbi say, so now, in order, yet interestingly enough, you're assuming that marriage morphs into a biblical marriage, even though the origins of that marriage are what? Are rabbinic. So the Gemara says that's like a case of Taos Isha Achos in our previous sugya, and yet we still see it's machlokes. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasamai b'hakamim. The Gemara says, here's the machlokes. Watch this. Mar savar adam yodeh she'en kiddushay ketana klum. So the Gemara says, here's the machlokes. One opinion says a person knows that kiddushay ketana is nothing. Now, say, what does it mean kiddushay ketana is nothing? In any, say, kiddushay ketana is only biblically meaningful when the father is marrying off the daughter. So one opinion says everyone knows that when Reuven remarries Rachel, Reuven knows that kiddushin is not really a kiddushin. In other words, it's not a kiddushin daraisa. The gamar ubal l'shem kiddushin, and therefore again Reuven knows that when Rachel becomes a gedola, what does he have to do? He has to have in mind that the bia that he has with her once she becomes a gedola, that's what affects the marriage. And therefore again, they have a true marriage. Therefore, were Reuven to die without children, Rachel would be able to do yibum or chalitza. Umar sabra einadam yodeh she'en kiddushay ketana klum. The other opinion says, no, most people don't know that kiddushay ketana is meaningless. V'chibal adaita de kiddushin harishonim kaboil. And ultimately, again, when he marries Rachel as a ketana, Reuven has no idea that when she becomes a gedola, he's got to go ahead and essentially have kavanah that the bia should once again be l'shem kiddushin. So because he has no idea about this, the entire marriage is built on what? On a bia with a kitana, right? Which is only what? Kiddushin d'Rabbanan. So we'll say that's the fundamental machlokes over here. Does a person know the mechanics of marriage enough to know that once his kitana wife becomes a gedola, he essentially has to re-affect halachic marriage with her or not? That's the machlokes. So we'll say, here we go. Everything comes back to the same case. A man does kiddushin with a tnai uba'al, and then he has relations with her. We'll say, but at the time of relations, the time of nisuin, what doesn't happen? He does not restate the tnai. He does. So what happens? So divrei hakol eino tzrichem men get. Everyone agrees that since he didn't restate the tnai, even though he didn't restate the tnai at the time of nisuin, nevertheless the tnai is in effect, and therefore non-compliance with the tnai causes the dissolution of the marriage even without a get. Eisvei, is that true? Eiser v'achabrei Ravika bar achsei. So says the Gemara, Eiser v'achabrei Ravika bar achsei, chalitza mutas kshera. Listen to this. A mistaken chalitza is kosher. Eizui chalitza mutas. So we'll say, what's an example of a mistaken chalitza? This takes us back a little bit. Amrei shlakish kol she'omer lo chalotzla ubekach atakonsa. Okay, here's a pretty good example of a mistaken chalitza, right? We tell the brother-in-law, do chalitza with your sister-in-law, and through this you'll become married to her. Okay, it's a pretty big mistake. So the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ani shona, bein shenis kavinhu v'lo niskavnehi, bein shenis kavnehi v'lo niskavinhu, chalitzasa psula ad sheis kavnu shnehem. So Rabbi says, listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. I think the halacha is like this. Whether, again, I will say, Rabbi Yochanan says, in order for chalitza to work, both of them has to have explicit kavanah. So I will say, so whether ultimately, again, he had kavanah, she didn't have kavanah, she had kavanah, he didn't have kavanah, ultimately, again, chalitza psula, ad sheis kavnu shneim. Chalitza only works if halacha l'maisa, they both have kavanah for chalitza. Va'at amrit chalitza sekshera, and ultimately, again, you're saying that such a chalitza would be kosher. So I will say, so remember, again, we have an interesting machlokes over here. So the Gemara is saying a chalitza mutas is kshera. Chalitza mutas is kshera. So the Gemara says, what's a chalitza mutas? So Reish Lakish says, an example of a mistaken chalitza is where he thinks chalitza affects marriage. Even though he thinks chalitza does the opposite of what it actually does, it still works. Rabbi Yochanan says, what are you talking about? Whereas we hold that in order for chalitza to work, both of them have to have the correct kavanas. And you're seeing that literally where he has the opposite kavanah will work. Ela Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol she'omer lo, here we go. What's an example, Rabbi say, of a chalitza mutas that would work, of a mistaken chalitza that would work? Listen to this. Kol she'omer lo, chalotzla almanas shetitein lach masayim zuz. A good example, Rabbi say, of a chalitza mutas would be like this. We tell brother-in-law, do chalitza with her on the condition that she's going to give you 200 zuz. So in other words, essentially what we're doing over here is we're convincing him to do chalitza by how? With money. So we tell him, do chalitza. Maybe, and they will say, by the way, you can frame this case wherever you want. He's reticent to do chalitza, whatever it is. So we tell him, do chalitza on the condition that you're going to receive 200 zuz. And then what happens after he does the chalitza? What does she say? Sorry, not going to do it. That's called the chalitza mutas. He did chalitza with the, I will say, essentially, look what's happening over here. He did chalitza with a t'nai. And I will say what happens. The t'nai is not fulfilled, but nevertheless, what's the halacha? The chalitza is kosher. The chalitza is kosher. So chalitza al t'nai, and the t'nai was not fulfilled. The chalitza is still kosher. Alma, what do you see from here? Kevan da'avid maisa achule achla l'tinai. They will say, watch this. This is incredible. So now says the Gemara, what do you see from here? That when you make a t'nai, Rabbi say, but then you do an action without that t'nai, the action stands even though the t'nai does not. Right? Even though the t'nai has not been fulfilled. But say, because watch this case, right? Reuven says, I'm doing chalitza on the condition that I get 200 zuz. Right? And then what happens? Reuven does the chalitza, he does the action, and what? The money was not given. What's talacha? The chalitza still works. So I will say, so therefore, every single time you make a condition, but then perform an action without the condition, ultimately the action still stands. The Gemara wants to suggest, Hachanami, Kevan Debal, Achuli Achli Latinas. We'll say, let's go back. So remember again, we're back. Everything, all roads lead back to the last line of Ayin Beis Amud Beis 72b. Where Rabbi say, we are plagued by a fundamental question that's been following us through the last blot. Ruvain says to Rachel, Hari'at Mikudeshes li amanatz she'ein alayich nidarim. Become Mikudeshes me on the condition that you've made no nidarim. And then Rabbi will say what happens. At the time of Nisuin, he does not restate the Tanai. Now what happens? He marries her. Chuppah, Bia. So Rabbi will say, now it turns out that what? She has nidarim. So what's the status of their marriage? Well, it sounds like based on what we just learned, what's the status of their marriage? Halachically valid marriage. And if they want to dissolve it, then what? Let her acquire a get. You made a Tanai. It's true you made a Tanai. But because you did not restate the Tanai at the time of the mice, at the time of the action, it sounds like what essentially, you've yielded on the Tanai. You've been mevatel the Tanai. You've forgone the Tanai. Forgone the Tanai. All right, well, you let go of the Tanai. Says the Gemara, Hachinami, kevan debail, once the husband engages in an action of bia, i.e. nisuin, achuli achloi litinoi, ultimately, again, you have forgiven the Tanai. So it sounds like we've resolved the issue. Amarle bar be Rav Shapir Kamrit. Do you think that makes sense? Michti, let's analyze this. This is fascinating. Michti, kol Tanai mehecha gamrinon. So we'll say this is great. A very yesodistic Gemara over here. Where do we learn out the concept of Tanai? Or we'll say in general, when I say the concept, I mean, where do we learn out the halachos of Tanai? The halachos of making conditions. Where do we learn that from? Mitnai b'nei Gad u'b'nei Ruvain. So I will say the paradigmatic example of Tanai is the Tanai that Moshe Rabbeinu made with b'nei Gad and b'nei Ruvain. What was that Tanai? That Tanai ultimately, you remember, b'nei Gad and b'nei Ruvain, they want to occupy. I shouldn't use that word because that's a bad word, right? They want to settle. They want to settle the Transjordanian lands, right? They say they have large flocks. They have large flocks. The Transjordanian lands were well-watered lands, lush lands. They want to stay there. And make that their Nachal and Eretz Yisrael. I will say, by the way, parenthetically, ever wonder why did Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain have such large flocks and everyone else didn't? In other words, like what do? They invested, right? They're in the desert for the last 40 years. Right? So how do they have larger flocks than anyone else? So also something amazing the Sfarim bring down. Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain possessed incredible emunah. And therefore, again, they refused to eat their livestock. Instead, all they wanted was to subsist on the man. The other Shvatim wanted meat in addition to the man. So they slaughtered livestock. Right? Therefore, again, their flocks were depleted. Bnei Gad, Bnei Ruvain was such ma'aminim. They felt that the man was such a gift from the Ribono Shel Olam that why should we eat basar when we have man? As such, they had the largest flocks within Klal Yisrael. And Abba said it's important to know because remember, when Moshe Rabbeinu hears their request, he takes it as a lack of emunah. And nothing could be further from the truth. They were the greatest Baal Emunah. They didn't want to eat anything other than man. That's why their flocks outnumbered everyone else's. But what they wanted to do was to make the Transjordanian lands part of Eretz Yisrael as well. And I'll tell you, that Baruch Hashem they did. Because remember something amazing. We always speak about the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu didn't get to go into Eretz Yisrael. And I will say to a certain degree, it's not a totally true statement. Moshe Rabbeinu stood in the Transjordanian lands. Those lands ultimately become the tribal portion of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain and Chatzi Shevet Menashe. So I will say, the Moshe Rabbeinu actually stood in land that would ultimately become part of Eretz Yisrael. He didn't get to cross over the Yarden. That is true. He didn't get to cross over the Jordan. But where Moshe Rabbeinu stood actually becomes part of Eretz Yisrael. Now again, it only becomes part of Eretz Yisrael retroactively, as we'll discuss in just a moment. But because of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, because of their emunah, Moshe Rabbeinu got to step foot in what would later on become Eretz Yisrael. Incredible. Shavuos, I remember again, Moshe Rabbeinu makes a condition with them. What's the condition? The condition he makes with Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain was, if you go and help your brethren fight to conquer Eretz Yisrael, then ultimately, again, you will get your portion on the Transjordanian lands. That was, I will say, there's a whole bunch of, so this was the example of a Tanai, of a condition. The lands will be yours if you help conquer. Now, I will say, so therefore, all of the halachos of Tanai of conditions are learned out from this Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. Now watch this. So the Gemara says, Tinah de efshar lekoyim de shaliach ki hasam havi tinai. So I'll say that one of the things we learn out is that ultimately, again, only a Tanai that can be fulfilled through a shaliach is a proper Tanai. Now I'll say, where do we get that from? Because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't administer or didn't oversee the execution of the Tanai. Who did? Yoshua. So one of the things we learn out is that a binding condition has to be something that can be delegated, right? To which the Gemara says, "Havitinai, tina de lo efshar lekayumi ayedei shaliach ki hasam lo havitina." Rabbi say, by the way, do you know why the Tanai by Chalitza doesn't work? It's not because he was mochal on the Tanai. It's because such a Tanai is invalid. You can't make a Tanai attached to Chalitza. Why? Because Chalitza is something that you cannot delegate. Right? The surviving brother cannot say, listen, I've got a busy day at the office. Do me a favor, stand in for me, right? Just let her spit in your shoe, right? And then that's it, right? Let's say, so you can't do that. You can't delegate chalitza. So because you can't, this is incredible. So one of the things we learn from Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven is, in order for Tanai to be binding, it has to be delegatable, if that's a word. Delegatable, good. Delegatable, right? So I'll say, so that like Moshe Rabbeinu delegated to Yoshua. So there's so this is incredible. They will say, let's go back for just a moment. So remember again, when we make it tonight with the brother-in-law, do chalitza on the condition that she'll get 200 zuz, and he doesn't end up getting the money yet the chalitza is still kosher. There's a simple reason for that. That's not because we assume he just forgave the Tanai. It's because the Tanai is invalid. Because any Tanai, ultimately, again, that can't be assigned to another party or delegated, ultimately it's not a valid Tanai. It's incredible. The Gemara says, 1 second. V'habiyah. 1 second, I will say, I can make the same argument ultimately again about Bia, right? Ultimately again, I will say that, remember, if a man goes ahead, so let's go back for just a moment. If a man by Nisuin were to say, all right, I'm engaging in this Bia with you on the condition that what? You do not have any Nidarim, I will say, everyone agrees that what? That such a Tanai works. Bia can't be delegated, right? Bia can't be delegated. So therefore, again, using this logic, then why should it tonight? Remember again, I just want to point out, our whole sugya is focused on what question? Where he made it tonight by Kiddushin, and he did not repeat it by Nisuin. But it goes without saying that what? That if he repeated it by Nisuin, everyone agrees that what? That the tonight works. But 1 second, based on what you just said, I will say, any tonight that can't be delegated to someone else is not a real Tanai. If that's the case, how does it Tanai? To which the Gemara says, no. Listen to this. To which the Gemara says, Hasam mishum de iskish havios la'adadi. I will say that's because, remember, halacha l'maisa, as we're going to see, Aisha niknis b'shlosha drachim. Right? There are 3 ways that you could affect kiddushin: kesef, shtar, and bia, and they are all equated with one another. 2 out of the 3 can be done through a shaliach. Even though Bia can't be done through a shaliach, Halach Lamaisa, the other 2 can, and they're grouped together. So when we look at the institution of Kiddushin or the institution of Nisuin, ultimately, again, those things can be done ultimately through a third party. Therefore, a Tanai will work. So we'll say, I just want to point out, Kesuvos is called Shas Katan, ultimately, again, because remember, you see these concepts, and like they're sprinkled all over. We'll say, but like this concept of a Tanai, Tanai is learned out from Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, and there are so many halachos. It has to be a Tanai kafel, phrased in the positive and in the negative, so many different things. But here's such a fascinating idea. In order for a Tanai to work, it has to be something that can be delegated to someone else. Therefore, again, we learned a fascinating new concept. Therefore, you can never attach a Tanai to Chalitza, for the simple reason that what? Chalitza is not delegatable. So the Gemara goes right there. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Ula, Bar Abba, Amar Ula, Amar Rabbi Lazar. So again, I just want to point out, we still have not resolved our issue. Right? In other words, our original machlokes, Rav and Shmuel, where he made a Tanai by Kiddushin, but didn't repeat the Tanai by Nisuin, What happens there? That's still our same machlokes Rav and Shmuel. We have our qualification of Rabbah, but we're still in this. So here we go. Amar Rav Ula bar Abba, Amar Ula, Amar Rav Elazar, HaMekadish Milva. Very interesting case. Let's say you're Mekadish a woman with a loan. Then Rabbi say, this is a great case. How does this work? Rashi says, B'milva, Shemachala milva shechayeves lo. V'amrina b'kiddushin de'ena mikudeshes, d'mishum d'misha shalav sa nitna lotza, or b'shus. Both say, this is great. This guy is a real romantic. Listen to this. Reuven lent Rachel $1,000. $1,000. So he comes over to her and says, you know what? Here's the deal. Let's get married. I'm not getting you anything, but you could keep the loan. You could keep the loan. That's Mekadish b'milva. So we'll say that's Mekadish b'milva. Mekadish b'milva. Or Uba'al al Tnai. Right, so ultimately again, or there was Bia ultimately again with the Tnai. Uba'al b'pachos mishav pruta. I'm sorry, let me say that differently. HaMekadish b'milva Uba'al. So we'll say this is a man who's Mekadish a woman with a loan. Now we'll say, I want to point out something. I'll tell you this now. Being Mekadish with a loan doesn't work. Doesn't work. Why not? You're giving her an item of value. Rabbi say there's a concept by loans, fascinating concept in halacha, that when you lend someone money, interestingly enough, that money becomes theirs. It's theirs. And what? At the time of the due date, ultimately, again, they have to repay you the money. But over the duration of the loan, the money belongs to the borrower. So I'll say, I tell you something interesting. Let me just show you where this comes up. Imagine for a moment, I lend Ruvain $1,000, 10 $100 bills. Right? And I walk into Ruvain's house and I see the money is piled on his, a month later, right? The money's due in a year, and I see the money piled on his dining room table. So I will say, that's not my money. That's not my money. The moment you loan someone money, this, and again, we'll say another Shas idea, is called milva lahotza nitna. Ultimately, again, a loan becomes literally for the use of the bar, becomes his money that is due at a later date. Therefore, you can't be Mekadish woman with a loan. Why not? Because halachically, essentially what? You're not giving her anything. The money, so to speak, already belongs to her. It's interesting way to look at it. The money belongs to her. The money belongs to her. Ultimately, again, it's just she has to pay you back at a later date. But the money that she has in her possession is already hers. So watch this case. So in this case, ultimately, what happens? So he's Mekadish her with a loan, ubal. But then ultimately there's Bia, there's Nisuin, or Al Tnai. He's Mekadish with the Tnai, Uba'al. And then I was saying in all of these cases there's Nisuin, right? Uba'al, is Bia afterwards. Pachov is Shavar Pruta, or he's Mekadish with less than a Shavar Pruta, Uba'al. And there's Bia. In all of these cases, Divrei Akol Tzrichim and a get. In all of these cases, if they want to get divorced, they require a get. Which is another way of saying what? Marriage is good. Marriage is good. Very interesting. Marriage is good. So let's analyze. I'm Rav Yosef bar Abba, I'm Rav Menachem, I'm Rav Yami, HaMekadish b'pachos mishav pruta ubal tzrichim and a get. So let's listen to this. So Rav Yosef bar Abba, sitting of Rav Menachem, named Rav Yami, ultimately, again, only in the case of a man who is Mekadish with less than a shava pruta, only in that case do you require a get. Baha hudalo tai, ava bahanach tai. I will say, ultimately, again, here's the difference. Everyone knows, Rav Menachem says, everyone knows that Allah Lamaisi, it can't be Mekadishim with less than a Shavar Pruta. Everyone knows that. And therefore, again, in the case where there's a Bia, his intention is for the Bia to go ahead and affect a true Kiddushin, and ultimately later on an Isuin as well. But in the other cases, people make mistakes that these things could work for a Kiddushin, and therefore, ultimately, again, it's a flawed marriage. I'm going to have Kanim Sheidu'ula, HaMekadesh al Tnai Ubal, Tzrichim Meneget. So we'll say, let's analyze this case. Now, we'll say the one that is most important for us is the case ultimately al Tanai uba'al, right? So we'll say, so just to understand what that case means, a man is mekadishum with a Tanai, the condition. Then there's Bia, right? The condition is not restated at the time of Bia. And then after Bia, it turns out that what? The Tanai was not fulfilled. So what does the Brisa say? The marriage works. The marriage works. That's the case we're focused on right now. So now let's analyze. So Amrav Khan Mesheidu'ula HaMekadesh al Tanai Uba'al Tzrichim Meneget. So we'll say if a man is Mekadesh al Tanai, and then again, then there's Bia, and the Tanai is not restated at the time of the Bia, but then I will say after they get married, the Tanai was not fulfilled. Tzrichim Meneget. She requires a get. In other words, that the marriage is valid. So Zeh Hayamaisa. This actually occurred. V'lo haya koach bechachamim lo tzia below get. And the Chachamim did not have the ability to go ahead and extract it from the marriage without a get. In other words, I will say, I just want to point out what's happening over here. The Gemara seems to be going in the direction that if a man is mekadesh a woman with a tanai, whatever the tanai is, we'll just go with our tanai, right? You are mekudeshes to me on the tanai with the condition that you have not made any nidarim, okay? Then there's bia nisuin, right? Without a restating of the condition. Then after they get married, it turns out that what? She made a nidarim. What kind of nidarim? I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to drink wine. I'm not going to wear colored clothing. All the afflictive nature nidarim. What's the halacha, Rabbosai? What's the halacha? They're still married. They're still married. And if they want to dissolve the marriage, they require a get, which Rabbosai seems to once again lean in favor of Rav. And what's the logic? Ein adam oseb bi'ilaso bi'ilas znus. A man does not want his act of relations to be an act of znus. And therefore, again, essentially, he forgives the Tanai. Then Rabbosai, good. That seems to be where we're holding right now. So the Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara says, good. Shabbos, remember again, the Torah is talking about over here, about ultimately, again, about a woman who is married and ultimately has relations with another man. So the Torah says, Vihilo nispasa, if she was not forced. In other words, if a woman has a consensual, adulterous relationship with another man, ultimately, again, she was not coerced, she becomes asura, she becomes prohibited to her husband. What do you see from here? Hanispasa, Vihilo nispasa, asura, hanispasa, muteres. But if she was coerced, chas v'shalom, right, she was violated, then what? She remains permitted to her husband. But there's another case, shafa pishlon ispasa muteres, where even if she wasn't coerced, she remains permitted to her husband. And who is that? Ve'ezo zo shekidushe kidushe tos. Shabbos say, what's the case of where a woman wasn't coerced, had relations with another man, and still remains permitted to her first husband? In a case where the kiddushin to the first husband was a kiddushay tos, which is an interesting case. In other words, if her marriage to the first husband was kiddushay tos, and then what? She had relations with a second man, she still remains permitted to technically go back and marry the first man. Shafilu b'na murkav al kesefa, even if ultimately, again, literally she has a child from that first marriage, amud beis b'ma'enes v'holechas la. Ultimately, again, she could simply walk away from that relationship. So we'll say what the Gemara is pointing out over here is something very interesting, that technically speaking, there are cases of kiddushay tos. Just to be clear, there are cases of kiddushay tos. Now we'll say the machlokes is what's the, again, we're kind of back at square one again. We're back right where we were, which is essentially what happens if a tanai is made at the time of kiddushin and not reiterated at the time of nisuin. So we're right back to our machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Rav says that halacha l'maaseh, if it was not reiterated at the time of nisuin, ultimately they're married. They're married, even though it turns out that there was non-compliance with tanai. Rav says, Ein adam oseb bilasa bilasa. This person doesn't want his act of religion to be an act of immorality. Therefore, essentially, he forgives the tanai. Whereas Shmuel says, no, halacha l'maaseh, once you state the tanai at the beginning of the process, then what? It devolves upon the process in its entirety, and non-compliance with the tanai leads to the voiding of the relationship. Incredible. So Tan Rabbanon, here we go. But a very interesting case. Holcha, eitzel chacham. So as I said, I just want to point out, I know we're doing a lot, but again, pretty much as long as you just keep in mind, Ayin Beis Amud Beis 72b, last line of the daf, that machlokes Rav and Shmuel. That's what this is all about. Now we're challenging Rabbah, right? Because Rabbah is suggesting that everyone agrees that halacha l'maaseh, where you made a tanai kiddushin and didn't restate it by nisuin, everyone agrees that ultimately, again, the tanai is no longer in effect. We're bombarding Rabbah with questions on that position that seem not to face it. So we'll say, watch this. Very interesting. Tan Rabbanon. Halcha eitzel chacham v'tira mikudeshes. So we'll say, this is a fascinating case. Watch this. Same case. Right? Reuven says to Rachel, Hareat mikudeshes li amanas she'en alayech nidarim. Become mikudeshes to me on the condition that you have no nidarim upon you. Okay, what happens, I will say? So now, they have kiddushin. It turns out that what happens? Rachel has nidarim. Just a couple, not going to eat meat, not going to drink wine, not going to wear colored clothing, not going to have fun, not going to enjoy life, whatever else, right? All the different nidarim, right? So what happens? Well, so now after Kiddushin, she has, so what does she do? What does she do after Kiddushin? She goes to a chacham to go ahead and for hataras nidarim. She wants to be released from that. So I will say, without getting into the process of how you can be released from vows, right? She goes to a chacham to remedy her neder situation. So what's the halacha? So halcha itza chacham v'tira nikudeshes. So I will say, ultimately, again, the Kiddushin is valid. The Kiddushin is valid because she went ahead and she took care. So watch this. We'll say, what about the following case? Man says to a woman, Reuben says to Rachel, Hariat mikudeshes li amanas she'ein lach mumin. Become mikudeshes to me on the condition you have no blemishes. So what happens? Turns out, after Kiddushin, she has a mum. But what does she do? Eitzel rofe veripa osa eina mikudeshes. So she goes to the doctor after her marriage, after a Kiddushin, in order to get her mum addressed. And now, Baruch Hashem, she's healed. I've been healed, right? She's healed. Right? It's Sunday morning. It's good to get healed, right? So we'll say, so ultimately, again, she's healed. I can walk, right? So she's healed, right? So Baruch Hashem, now what? We'll say, what's the halacha? She's not Mikudeshes. So you hear the two cases? So ask the Gemara, Ma bin chacham l'rofe. So we'll say, I just want to point out what a fascinating case this is. So case one, Hariat mikudeshes li amanas she'ein lach nidarim alayich. You have no nidarim, right? She has nidarim. She goes to a chacham after Kiddushin. The chacham ultimately releases her from her nidarim, mikudeshes. Case two, you're mikudeshes to me amanas that you don't have a mum. She does have a mum. She goes to the doctor. She's healed from the mum. She's not mikudeshes. Ask the Gemara, why is the distinction? This is fascinating. So here we go. Ma bein chacham l'rofe. What's the difference between a chacham and a rofe? Here we go. Chacham okir es haneder meikaro. The rofe eno ela merape ela mikano lahaba. So here's the difference. A chacham, when he's ultimately, again, a chacham has the ability to retroactively uproot the neder as if it's never been made. Then I will say there are technicalities. There's hataras nedarim, hafaras nedarim. Okay, leaving that aside, the point over here is the concept of annulment or even revocation of vows has the ability to retroactively uproot the neder. Retroactively uproot it means that what? It was never made. If it was never made, then at the time of Kiddushin, did she have any neder upon her? No. Contrast that, Rabbi say, with what? With what? With being healed from a mum. What is being healed, right? Rabbi say, when you are healed from your mum, right? Ultimately, again, what does that do? Only mikanu lahaba. Healing ultimately helps you from this point going forward. Rabbi say, I want to tell you something absolutely amazing. And therefore, again, based on that, therefore, again, at the time of the Kiddushin, she was in non-compliance with the Tanai. She had a mum, and therefore the Kiddushin is not valid. There's a beautiful Gemara. There's one exception to this refuah rule. Right? So the Gemara, it's an interesting distinction. Refuah, healing, right? But we know this. Just think about it just a moment. Healing can never go ahead and retroactively remove anything. I will say, in fact, here's what's amazing about healing. Right? Even with healing, even when you heal, sometimes there's residual effects of the illness. Sometimes there's residual effects of the actual healing itself. There's one exception. This will say, what's the one exception? Gedola tshuva shemavia refuah liolam. There's one type of healing in this world that has the ability to work even retroactively, and that's the healing, restorative, cathartic powers of tshuva. See, I will say, any type of healing of the guf could only work mikan ulahaba, going forward. But the healing of the soul, the healing of the neshama, the healing of tshuva, even has the ability to work retroactively. Gidol tshuva, the Gemara says, tshuva is great. Shemavia refuah li olam. It brings healing. And we know that tshuva is so powerful that what? Zidonos na'asis lo kizechuyos. You could turn your averus even into mitzvahs. Physical healing has limitations. Only works mikana lahaba. Spiritual healing could even work retroactively. So the Gemara says, "V'atanya eitzel chacham ve'etira eitzel rofe veripa osa eina mikudeshes." We have a brayso that says that if she went to the chacham to be released from the neder, or she went to the doctor to heal her, eina mikudeshes, that it doesn't work. So what's going on is contradiction. Amar Rabba lo kasha harei meir harei Rabba Lazar. Two different opinions. So I say harei meir da Amar. Here we go. So what's fascinating? Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that a man wants his wife to be degraded in front of Beis Din. I will say, it doesn't actually sound as bad as it sounds, right? Or it's not as actually bad. However, what it means is Rabbi Meir doesn't. It's considered to be humiliating or degrading for a woman to have to go to Beis Din for annulment or revocation of her vows. So I will say, whether it's that like she has to disclose her vows, or again, she's a woman coming into the company of men, either way, it's something uncomfortable. Rabbi Meir says a man doesn't mind if his wife has to suffer that discomfort, ultimately, again, for the greater good of their marriage. And therefore, again, if her vows have the ability to be revoked, Rabbi Meir says husband is totally okay with that. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Lazar da'amar, Ein Adam Rabbi Lazar is of the opinion that no, a man doesn't want his wife to have to go to Beis Din. Therefore, Rabbi say again, here's a distinction. According to Rabbi Meir, if Reuven says to Rachel, "Hariat mikudeshas li amenas she'in alayach nedarim," become mikudeshas on the condition that what you have no nedarim, and she does have nedarim, but she's willing to go to Beis Din to get those nedarim revoked. According to Rabbi Meir, fine, husband is okay with that. Your wife is going to be embarrassed. Okay, so she'll suffer a little bit of embarrassment, ultimately for the greater good of the marriage. He's willing to deal with that. Rabbi Lazar says, a man didn't sign up for that. I don't want my wife going to Beis Din. I don't want that. And therefore, if it turns out that you have Nedarim, even though you can get them revoked in Beis Din, the marriage is still void. The marriage is still void. So they're fascinating. So the Gemara says, so I will say, Maihi. So what is this case? Here we go. This nan, very interesting, I will say. Let's at least we'll begin this today. Mahi, this nan, hamotzies ishto mishum neder lo yachzir, mishum shemra lo yachzir. So Rabbi say this is another fascinating halacha. We'll see this in Masechet Gittin. If a man divorces his wife because of a neder, he is not permitted to remarry her. Similarly, if he divorces her because of a shemra, a bad reputation, he is not permitted to remarry her. And I will say, what's the chap over here? Generally, the halacha is, unless you're a Kohen, if a man divorces his wife, right, and then has a change of heart, you're allowed to marry her remarry her, as long as what? She didn't marry anyone else in the interim. There are two exceptions to this rule. If a man divorces his wife because she made a particular neder, because she made a particular neder, right, or because of a bad reputation, he's not allowed to remarry. Now, I'll say, what are we concerned about? Here's what we're concerned about. Let's play this out. So let's say ultimately, again, Reuven divorces Rachel because she has a bad reputation. He heard some negative rumors about her. Then, okay, so they get divorced. Rachel remarries, and now it turns out that the rumors were unequivocally false. What are we concerned about? That Reuven's going to say, had I known that the rumors were false, I would have never given you a get. The Rebbe say that's a very scary halachic reality. Why? Because now that could potentially undermine the authenticity of the get. Same thing with the neder, right? Reuven divorces Rachel because she made a neder. Then after they get divorced, Rachel gets the neder revoked or annulled, and Reuven says, had I known that you could get the neder revoked or annulled, I would have never divorced you. Very scary, because what does that do? If she gets remarried, that casts a pall upon the validity of her second marriage. So we'll say it's fascinating. So essentially what Chazal did was like this. Reuven, if you are divorcing your wife, either because of an neder or shemra, we make it unequivocally clear to him at the time of the divorce that this divorce, all sales are final, right? All divorces are final, right? This is it. Understand that when you go ahead and you divorce her, you waive your right of remarriage. It's fascinating. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yehuda says, it depends. Kol neder sheyadu barabim lo yachzir. Rabbi Yehuda says, if it's a neder, ultimately again that the rabbim know about, then ultimately that's the type of marriage he can't remarry her. Lo yadu barabim yachzir. But halacha l'maisa, if it's a neder that the rabbim did not know about, then ultimately what? You can't remarry. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Kanove sheyadu barabim shenadartu b'fnei asara. So Rashi defines that as any neder you made in public that people know about. Lo yachzir. Kasavar taima shaloyu prutos b'nedarim. So okay, we're going to leave this. So Meir Rameir says, Kol neder shetzarech hakiras chacham lo yachzir. If it's any neder, ultimately again, that requires the intervention of a chacham, that's the type of neder where if he divorces her because of it, he cannot remarry her. V'she'eno tzarech hakiras chacham yachzir. But it's a type of neder that doesn't require hakiras chacham. Ultimately, again, he can remarry her. Rabbi Elazar, Omer Echad, fine. Omer Rabbi Elazar, Lo asru tzarech ele mipnei she'eno tzarech. Rabbi Elazar says, ultimately, we only answered the case of a neder that requires chakiras chacham because of a case of a neder ultimately that doesn't require chakiras chacham. So we'll stop over here for today. I'm leaving you a little bit on the middle of this sugya. We're going to go back in tomorrow's daf and focus a bit more on the statement of Rabbi Yehuda. But I will say, I just want to point out, the good news is, we did a lot of Gemara today, right? And Baruch Hashem, we are caught up with the rest of the Daf Yomi cycle. Baruch Hashem, right? The good news is we also saw a lot of fascinating pieces. What's the bad news? The bad news is we're actually not really any further in solving our fundamental question. And I shouldn't say that. We are a little bit further. Because they're both saying the truth is, should I just give it to you now? I'm going to give it to you now. Bossai, because the truth is, I want you to end off with something solid. Because now, by the way, now we're making a little bit of a sharp neder detour, right? Because now we're going to be heavy into Nedarim only for about 10 lines, only for 10 lines. And I will say we're leaving out to Rabbi Huda. So I will say, so now what I want to point out is like this. Let's pause. I want to end up with a piece of halacha l'maisa. Back to Rav and Shmuel. Let's say remember again. Man makes a tonight. Hariat nikodeshas li almanas she'en alayich nedarim. Right? I'm being mekadesh on the condition that what you have no nedarim upon you. And then Rabbi said, then what happens? Then at the time of nisuin, he doesn't restate the neder. They get married. Chuppah, bia. What does she tell him? What does he find out during Shara Brachas? What does he find out? She has nedarim. Right? They're serving fleishiks at Shara Brachas. She's not eating, right? She orders a salad. Says, what's going on? First, chas v'shalom, he's afraid that she's a vegetarian. Chas v'shalom, lo aleinu rachmana litzlan, right? So I'll say, then she turns out that, no, even worse, I'm an adronis. I don't know if it's worse, right? I made a neder. So I'll say, see now, what's the shaila? Right? He finds them in the middle of Shara Brachas. What's the shaila? What's the status of the marriage? So I'll say, listen to this. Shulchan Aruch, Even HaEzer, Simin Lamid Ches, Sif Lamid Hey. Here we go. The Gemara says, Lefichach. It's a longer Shulchan Aruch, but I'm just thinking the conclusion. Lefichach. HaMekadish al Tnai, Uba'al Stam, Okines Stam. This is our case. A man does Kiddushin with a Tnai, but then either the Bia or the Nisuin, because remember, Nisuin can be affected by Chuppah as well. Goes to the Chuppah, Stam, Bia Stam, in other words, doesn't restate the Tanai at the time of Nisuin. What's the halacha? Get ready? Ready for it? Hare zu tzricha get. Afa pi shalonis kaim hatnai, shema bitel hatnai, kishabal osha kishakines. The Shulchan Aruch paskins the halacha l'maisa. If you don't repeat the Tanai at the time of Nisuin, we essentially assume that halacha l'maisa you went ahead and negated the Tanai. So the lack of restating the Tanai at the time of Nisuin. Now, I want to point out over here, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't go ahead and he says Shema bitel hatanai kishavashkenes. Maybe you were mevatel the Tanai. Maybe the fact that you didn't restate it at the time of Nisuin ultimately makes it as if you were mevatel it. In other words, if you really cared about it all that much, you learned Daf Yomi, you know that you should restate it at the time of Nisuin. The fact that you didn't restate it at the time of Nisuin indicates to us that perhaps you were mevatel it. Now I will say perhaps it's not definitive, but perhaps is enough to tell us what? That if you do want to dissolve this marriage, ultimately what? Halacha l'maisa, you need a get, which will say essentially means that Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam paskin is the same way. Here, obviously, the Shulchan Aruch is a bit more explicit than the Rambam. We paskin halacha l'maisa like Rav. Therefore, again, failure to restate the Tanai at the time of Nisuin essentially allows us to assume that you are mevatel the Tanai. Therefore, the marriage is a regular marriage. This solution will require a get. I will say shkoyach. We'll stop over for today. Should make a scene on the sugya, yeah. We're not finished with the sugya. I gave it to a little bit early, but okay. All right, Chevron on Zoom. Have a great day, everyone. Wonderful to see everyone. Connection.